In my last video, I did a response to intellectually and morally impaired women's studies professor Rebecca Sullivan from the University of Calgary. In an interview on CBC News, she offered an overview and interpretation of the Red Pill movie and MRAs generally speaking. Her stumbling, make it up as you go along stab at a thoughtful narrative never managed to rise above a borderline psychotic tug-of-war between mendacity and mental retardation. If the world of stupid things feminists say were geopolitical, Professor Sullivan would be the unquestioned superpower. And that's despite the fact that during the entirety of the interview, she kept blurting out irrational fears like she had Tourette's. It's easy to conclude, if you're being unusually charitable toward feminism, that Sullivan is an outlier, that she is an uncharacteristic, mentally sluggish representative of feminist thought, that she is, if you will, the big red of feminist academia, the Trigglypuff of women's studies. But if you do reach that conclusion, I think you do so in error. While there are certainly more articulate feminist spokesmen with more polished and thoughtful presentations, what I suggest to you is that in this case the term more articulate spokesman is a euphemism for better liar, and for feminists who are even more self-deluded than Sullivan. I'll demonstrate that with the first of several examples from the Red Pill movie, in which leading academic feminists were given the opportunity to respond to issues made by men's rights activists. We start with Michael Messner, a professor of sociology and gender studies at the University of Southern California. In the Red Pill movie, Messner was given the opportunity to offer his perspective on the MRM's assertion that fathers experience severe bias in family courts, particularly where it comes to access to their children. Here's what he had to say.
Well, I'll just say I don't think it's I don't think that a lot of their assumptions are correct to start with. There's no doubt that there have been some men who get just screwed by court decisions and custody cases. But I think when you look at the broader patterns, it's still the case that in intact heterosexual families with kids, women are still doing the vast majority of the housework and childcare, and there's a lot of sort of father absence, lack of participation by fathers, some of whom I think then after divorce happens end up suddenly wanting equality, as fathers when they haven't really been participating equally as fathers before. So to me, it always kind of swings back to the feminist perspective of how we need to push for full equality across the board, including before divorces. And if we have that, then we might expect more symmetry after divorces.
Okay, compared to watching Sullivan bumblefuck her way through responding to the softballs thrown directly at her bat in the CBC interview, Messner looks like a thinker and orator that would give Socrates a run for the money. That is, until you take Sullivan out of the picture and just consider the merits of what Messner is actually saying. There is no doubt, says Messner, that there are some men who just get screwed by court decisions in custody cases. Some men? Indeed, a tiny number in Messner's mind, and I am sure he is clearly eager to poo-poo their shredding in family courts so that he can cut to the quick of his true worldview, that men have no one to blame but themselves for what happens in family courts, and worse, that their objections to being denied access to their children are akin to suddenly discovering religion, that while married, they were largely deadbeat dads where it concerned physical involvement with the children and family. Here, let's listen to him again.
I think when you look at the broader patterns, it's still the case that in intact heterosexual families with kids, Women are still doing the vast majority of the housework and childcare, and there's a lot of sort of father absence, lack of participation by fathers. Some of whom I think then, after divorce happens, end up suddenly wanting equality, as fathers when they haven't really been participating equally as fathers before.
And so what, one must wonder, does Messner imagine men might be doing during all this absentee parenthood? What could possibly be more important to men than being there to spend quality time with the family? Or perhaps, much, much worse, what could these men be up to that would mean they were not doing their fair share of the dishes, or mopping floors, or laundry? And this, dear viewers, is where it is easy for me to fantasize about grabbing Michael Messner by the collar and shaking him senseless, then dragging him by said collar outside the comforting cocoon of his ivory tower and into the real world where the majority of men reside. To construction sites and chemical plants, to offshore oil rigs, or into the parking lots of truck stops, where nearly 3 million men in America alone spend most of their nights curled up on a bed the size of a cot, just a few inches from their workplace behind the wheel. I'd like to throw him into a cab, literally, and force him to listen to the cab driver talk about the hours he puts in. I'd like to drop him onto a military base and let him hear stories of all the men who are deployed for months at a time to unforgiving and hostile environments. And after all that, I'd like to put him into a dunce's corner wearing the hat until he finally admits to what pushes most of these men to do what they do. Messner lives in a dream world where men are so averse to cooking meals and changing diapers that they'll voluntarily get in a fishing boat or walk into a coal mine or don a fire suit and head out for wherever those things take men, sometimes without returning, just to avoid taking on the daunting challenges of being a parent or a husband. And he fails utterly and completely to see that what men do is almost always in the name of doing what their families, and indeed the world around them, expect and demand them to do. They sacrifice their time, their comfort, their well-being, and a few other things, all in the process of sacrificing their time with their families to do what they must do, to take care of the people they love. Messner, in his abject blindness to the experience of men, only sees them when they are home helping their wives. If they are anywhere else, like riding the back of a garbage truck in sub-zero weather or driving a Humvee through a combat zone, they don't exist. They are just absent fathers, undeserving of legal justice, and indeed undeserving of their own children. And any of them with the audacity to object to that, well, they're just bitter malcontents who suddenly wanted to become fathers when they were cast aside. And of course, in Messner's mess of a mind, the solution to this uniquely male problem is feminism. Here's a short reminder of what he had to say about that.
So, to me, it always kind of swings back to the feminist perspective of how we need to push for full equality across the board, including before divorces. And if we have that, then we might expect more symmetry after divorces.
And there you have it, the feminist perspective, which of course Messner states quite clearly is what he always comes back to. It is the perspective that allows him to entirely dismiss the lived experience of men in favor of whatever is perceived to benefit a woman. And for Messner, that obviously applies in a way no less disingenuous or woefully inaccurate than what we saw from Rebecca Sullivan. Earlier in his statement, Messner managed to use the term equality as fathers, and to my surprise, though I suppose I shouldn't have been, he actually used that term with a straight face. I have a message for you, Michael, should you be listening. You might appear more credible and much less insulated from the real world if you could recognize that there is no such thing as equality as fathers. Your whole feminist shtick is predicated on the idea that we live in a patriarchy that bans women from the world of men, that keeps them locked into menial household duties against their will. And because you must absolutely abide by that phony narrative, you have to distort reality every time you open your mouth about it. You have to at least pretend like you believe that women want to occupy our battlefields, our coal mines, our transportation industry, and our construction sites. You have to engage in the fantasy world of women who don't choose quality of life over the role of primary provider because of the two sexes, they are the one afforded that choice. You keep selling a narrative of women denied equality even as the masses of them prove, generation after generation, that they don't want it. The solution to the version of reality your career is built on is simple. When workplace deaths, including combat, are 50% women, you will largely have the equality across the board you pretend to support. But of course, you know that will never happen. And the reason for it being, at its most fundamental level, that women want nothing to do with it. So instead of dealing with that very obvious fact, you push for more female inclusion in boardrooms and executive offices while ignoring that the rest of the world, that massively bigger part of it filled with blood, sweat, and tears, even exists. So intent you are on ignoring all these inconvenient realities that even in cases of the most egregious violations of men's and fathers' rights, you paint a story that justifies and even celebrates the pain inflicted on them. I have to reconsider some of my opening thoughts. Mr. Messner, Rebecca Sullivan, as vapid and dishonest as her comments about men's rights activists were, has absolutely nothing on you in the area of intellectual and moral depravity. You and her share the same academic trailer park values. I am grateful, though, that I have survived long enough to see the world slowly wake to the sick ideology you further, to the reality that feminism is cancer. And that is it for another Talk from an Ear for Men. As always, I hope you've enjoyed, and see you next time.